Roman Rosdolsky, 1897 to 1967. An Introduction by Anson G. Rabinbach. Rosdolsky's comments on the method of Marx's Capital and its importance for contemporary Marxist scholarship was delivered in September 1967 as the opening paper of the Frankfurt Colloquium commemorating the 100th anniversary of Marx's Capital. At this colloquium, held only 1 month before Rosdolsky's death in Detroit, Rosdolsky foreshadowed the posthumous publication of his major work, The Origins of Marx's Capital. The 2 volumes of this publication are the result of 20 years of work during emigration in the United States and are now recognized as the major commentary on Marx's Grundrisse. Rosdolsky's deceptively short but highly compressed analysis of the dialectical method in Capital is important not only as a prelude to his larger theoretical work on which it is based, but also for its relation to the political and theoretical development of Marxism in the late 1960s. In this context, Rosdolsky challenged not only the old Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy, but those new orthodoxies that have recently challenged the petrified Soviet Marxism. Rosdolsky pointed to the inadequacy of the purely economistic Marx interpretations, which neglect the dialectical and historical social theory in his work, often ignoring the importance of value-producing labor as the subjective side of capital, as well as the historical transformation of use value in its commodity form. Perhaps more importantly, Rosdolsky emphasized the Hegelian roots of the conceptual and historical dialectic in both the Grundrisse and Capital. This came at a time when the French structuralist interpretation of Marx's so-called epistemological break with humanism, anthropology, and Hegel was gaining acceptance outside of Paris. It was not coincidental that the first to debate Rosdolsky's thesis at the colloquium was Nikos Poulantzas. At the same time, this emphasis coincided with the quote, or so-called rediscovery of Marx by the West German New Left, who were themselves eager to dispense with the dialectical Marxism of Lukács, Korsch, and the Frankfurt School, which was characteristic of the, quote, now superseded anti-authoritarian phase, end quote, of the student movement. Rosdolsky's paper therefore set the tone for the Frankfurt debate and the further discussion within and among major positions in Marxist theory in the late 1960s. Among the participants in this discussion were Alfred Schmidt, Ernest Mandel, Nikos Poulantzas, Wolfgang Abendroth, Peter von Oertzen, Oscar Knecht, and Fritz Behrens. Rosdolsky was almost completely unknown until the publication of The Making of Marx's Capital. Born in Lemberg, Galicia, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, now in the Ukrainian Soviet Republic in 1898, he attended gymnasium, I don't know how you pronounce that, but school, whatever that is in Europe, during World War I and was a member of the illegal anti-war organization, the International Socialist Revolutionary Youth of Galicia. The group formed the embryo of the Western Ukrainian Communist Party, for a time a section of the Polish Communist Party, whose leadership was almost entirely eliminated in the persecutions of the Stalin period. After the war, Rosdolsky emigrated to Prague and later to Vienna, where he worked as a researcher for the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow, which was then under the direction of David Ryazanov. In the early 1930s, however, Rosdolsky began to dissociate himself from the main policies of the Comintern, and though he felt close to the more progressive and independent early Soviet economic theorists, such as Preobrazhensky and Isaac Ilyich Rubin, he became a follower of Trotsky and an opponent of the Soviet leadership. During this first period of emigration, Rosdolsky was concerned with the national question and the history of the peasantry in his native Galicia. His doctoral dissertation, completed in Vienna, was a study of the Slav problem, entitled Das Problem der Geschlechtlosen Völker bei Marx und Engels. The Problem of Peoples Without History in Marx and Engels. Leaving Vienna after the insurrection of 1934, Rosdolsky returned to Lemberg, where he published his first work, The Eastern Galician Village Community and Its Dissolution, in 1936. The publication of his second major work, the two-volume study of the Galician peasantry, was interrupted by World War II and was first published in Warsaw in 1962. When the Nazis occupied Poland, Rosdolsky was in Krakow. He was arrested there in 1942 and interned in Auschwitz. Oranienburg and Ravensbrück. See, it's weird trying to pronounce these old concentration camps. He was arrested there in 1942 and interned at Auschwitz, Oranienburg, and Ravensbrück until 1945. After the war, he spent a short time teaching at an Austrian trade union school, finally emigrating to the United States in 1947. Here, Rosdolsky discovered a rare 1939 edition of the Grundrisse at the Boutinger Archive in New York in 1948, and began to work on his commentary of it. Rosdolsky also published a revised version of his dissertation, a critique of Marx and Engels on the Slav question, as well as a number of histories which remained unpublished during his lifetime. Die Bauernabgeordneten im Konstituierenden Österreichischen Reichstag 1848-49, dealing with the agrarian question in 1848, and an unfinished work on the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, and the isolation of the Russian Revolution. Parts of the latter were recently published in Germany. From 1949 to 1951, Rosdolsky taught in the history department at Wayne State University in Detroit. Obstacles to his Grundrisse work caused by the inadequate library collection there are noted in the introduction to The Making of Marx's Capital. Although practically none of Rosdolsky's work has appeared in English, a notable exception is the short article entitled A Revolutionary Parable on the Equality of Man, published in 1963. Rosdolsky traces this parable from the Ukraine in the 1830s and 1840s to the 1890s and even to early 19th century Haiti, where it may have originated. The parable translates a radical egalitarian idea into simple concrete form, and in addition provides insight into the influence of this revolutionary tradition on Rosdolsky's own convictions. In the story, a revolutionary enters a local tavern and places a grain of wheat on the table. The grain represents the Tsar. A few more grains are added, which the revolutionary identifies as the governors, other officials, army officers, and the nobility. Finally, a handful of grain is poured over the others with the words, quote, "Look, these are all of us. Can you tell me who was the Tsar, the governor, or the landlord?" End quote. The publication of Rosdolsky's comments becomes especially appropriate in the light of the recent English translation of the Grundrisse. This is particularly important since his 2-volume commentary has not been translated. Rosdolsky's comments provides an important counterpoint to the largely anti-Hegelian introduction to the English edition, written by Martin Nicholas. In his introduction, Nicholas emphasizes that Marx made a, quote, false start by beginning the Grundrisse with the category of, quote, material production, rather than with the category of the, quote, commodity, which embodies the key antithesis of bourgeois society. Nicholas thus argues that Hegel and the Hegelian starting point of the Grundrisse manifest a dialectic of identity, whereas the Marxist dialectic of capital manifests a dialectic of non-identity. According to Nicholas, it is only after 7 notebooks of the Grundrisse that the first category of the commodity, the, quote, true starting point and, quote, materialist beginning of capital, and the critique of political economy is discovered. Fuck yeah. For Nicholas, this step represents the point where the, quote, mystical Hegel is left behind. This view is implicitly challenged by Rosdolsky, who sees the method in the Grundrisse as developing from abstract relations to the, quote, living whole. Living concrete whole, and therefore is indispensable, but not only for arriving at the starting point of capital, but also for an understanding of commodity production itself. The categories that lead to the inner contradiction within the commodity are unfolded in the Grundrisse through the historical and logical mediations that emerge from the fundamental category of, quote, capital in general. This is no, quote, false start, write it in the first volume of Capital, nor is it a case of merely, quote, isolating the similarities between the Grundrisse and Capital, as Keith Tribe maintains in his critique of Rosdolsky. Rather, the development of capital presupposes the development of the notion of, quote, capital in general in the Grundrisse. In the earlier work, one can see Marx in the process of working out this method. Nicholas's search for the end of Hegel and the beginning of Marx is scholastic. Nicholas's attempt to distinguish Marx and Hegel by contrasting Marx's dialectic of non-identity to Hegel's dialectic of identity is problematic in another aspect. For Nicholas, The commodity represents the dialectical, quote, non-identical beginning of capital, which, unlike Hegel's logic and the Grundrisse, is concrete, determinate, and contradictory in itself. Nicholas therefore separates the, quote, subjective or absolute, end quote, mediations of Hegel's, quote, conciliatory and harmonizing dialectic, end quote, which for Nicholas is no dialectic at all, from the, quote, conditional, quote, non-identical dialectic of Marx's, quote, revolutionary subversive method. Marx's concept of the identity of opposites, in Nicholas's terms, is, quote, conditional, but their non-identity, their struggle, antagonism, and breakup are inevitabilities, end quote. Here, Nicholas's argument leads him to a Marxism of revolutionary inevitability by focusing on non-identity as the central aspect of Marx's dialectic in Capital. Nicholas, not unlike the Marxism of the Second and Third Internationals, derives revolutionary inevitability from formal logical categories. The subjective moment of revolutionary possibility is thus superseded by the automism. The subjective moment of revolutionary possibility is thus superseded by the automism of an objective process. As Rosdolsky shows, and here Nicholas seems to contradict his earlier point, the difference is between the development of the method of inquiry in the Grundrisse and the method of presentation in Capital. Marx's Grundrisse is concerned with a historical critique of the categories of bourgeois political economy. He considers these categories to be an abstract expression of the total social labor that constitutes the living, subjective essence of the objective historical form of accumulated social wealth, capital. Whereas in the Grundrisse, Marx begins with a developmental and historical view of the bourgeois economic literature, pointing to its consistent naturalization and reification of real social relations. In Capital, the procedure is reversed. Quote, it begins with the finished results of the developmental process, end quote. In the world of commodities, Verenwelt, quote, the general human value of labor constitutes its specific social character, end quote. The end result of bourgeois economy, the inverted theoretical reproduction of the reified forms of the immediate economic sphere, in which the real social and historical process is embedded, is the starting point of Capital. Marx begins with reification in its most immediate appearance, not simply because it contains an embryo, the fundamental contradiction of bourgeois society, but because it masks it as well. Thus, Marx presents the discovery of the essential relationships of capital from the standpoint of its most immediately accessible and apparent expression, the commodity. The value relations within the commodity constitute the dialectic that demands an analysis of the historical relation that produces this form. It is therefore the purpose of both the Grundrisse and Capital to move from the level of being as such, appearance, to the level of the social and historical relations, essence, constituting that immediacy. Marx is concerned with a history that embodies that history's own subjectivity, concrete social labor. There can be no question of a, quote, epistemological break from the, quote, subjects of the Grundrisse to the, quote, rigorous analysis of the capitalist mode of production in Capital, end quote. The specter of Hegel haunts both these works. Rosdolsky's comments is now, more than ever, relevant to the development of theoretical Marxism, especially to an understanding of the importance of the dialectic as a historical logic in Marx. The epistemological foundation of Marx's method demands that thought is neither immediately identical with its object nor logical as such. Rather, it is history itself which produces the alienation between idea and reality. Without the unity of a historical and logical mode of understanding, which takes as its starting point the historicity of the theory itself, Marxism results either in a, quote, objectivist historicism, which identifies the immediately given, quote, facts of history as its essence, or in a naturalized, quote, historical objectivism, which comprehends history as the mechanical procession through inexorable stages. At the same time, a purely, quote, logical dialectic of concepts, with a, quote, theoretical object which is not empirically given, end quote, as in structuralism, or even the positivist categorization of an essentially, quote, meaningless reality, fundamentally ignores the totality of history as the real activity of those social individuals which constitute its real essence. As such, categories become fixed, resistant to historical change, and incapable of their own transformation and mediation in relation to a transformed object. Whereas the logic of Marx's dialectic grasps the essential connectedness and subjectivity of historical praxis, which is masked by events and actions in which it is ultimately objectified, it cannot proceed beyond the history that provides the categories and at the same time confines the categories. This is Rosdolsky's point.